Welcome back to the Builders Bench. I'm Craig Larkins. Some big moves coming out of Ottawa that directly impact construction. We've got a new majority government, spring economic update, and all of this landing at a time when the cost to build keeps climbing, with fuel prices now adding fresh pressure. To unpack it all, we're joined by Louis-Philippe Champagne, Associate Vice President of Public Affairs and Industry Practices at the Canadian Construction Association, and a regular on the bench. Welcome back to the bench.
What's up?
Some big news coming out of Ottawa this week. Let's start with the big headline, of course, from the latest spring economic update. Lots of construction-related initiatives in there. Do you want to just break it down for us? Obviously, the biggest one, the $6 billion in Team Canada Strong.
Big announcement, very fresh, right? This happened at the time of recording. That was yesterday afternoon at 4 p.m. The Minister of Finance, Louis-Philippe Champagne, stood in the House of Commons to introduce their very first spring economic statement. I'll remind people that the budget cycle has changed under Prime Minister Carney. Instead of having a spring budget and a fall economic statement, which was the tradition, they flipped that around. So the last federal budget was on November 3rd. The next one will be in the fall. This was the halfway point to say, here's where we are in our fiscal plan going forward. And just like Budget 2025 was very focused on the construction industry and major project and defense investment, which the CCA was quite happy to see, as you can imagine, this is very much a direct segue to that theme of we want to build Canada. We want to invest in our construction sector. So a really good time to be in construction, to be a construction company, and play a significant role in this agenda to build Canada strong, to create this economic powerhouse in a time of high disruption around the world, and especially in North America. So what is in there? Again, it's very fresh. We're still looking into the detail. We'll have a briefing note ready in matters of hours. But there's really two big points I want to touch on. The most significant one, if you look at any media coverage, is workforce development. So one of the big push from the CCA and most of our local association over the last 6 months has been, hey, Budget 25 sounds great, but we need the people to build these things. You're not going to build billions in national defense infrastructures and major projects from LNG to high-speed train and trade corridor if you don't have construction worker from all across construction to join these projects. We already have significant vacancies in construction. It's been the case for years. We need to address workforce development challenges. So this economic statement do bring up a number of concerns and say, hey, we see that there's an issue. We've heard you guys. Here's what we're willing to do on that regard. And the cool thing that CC is quite happy to see is they're moving away from exclusively financing unions to providing support to the entire industry. And that's something we've advocated a lot in recent months, saying, hey, the UTIP program, for example, presented in the budget, the Union Trading Incentive Program, great initiative for all the construction workers that are unionized and the company that employ them. But for the million, literally 1 million employees in Canada that are not unionized, how do they receive training funds? How can we get them in the workforce? This time around, we see very direct investment in terms of tax credit, for example, or incentive for workers and for employers to promote both employment and skill development, as well as support for colleges and institutes that they'll need to figure out with the provinces. So it's a very positive step forward in saying, hey, construction, we heard you, we're going to work on this. The caveat to this, not a big deal, but something that we need to work together to solve going forward, is the misconception that still remains in government between what is a construction worker and a skilled trade worker. Very closely related concept, but not all construction workers are skilled trade or Red Seal. There's a lot of construction workers within the ecosystem that works in the back office that are professional consultant, for example, or just general labor, especially in the civil sector, where the NUC code and the skilled trade are just not the right match. So if you extensively fund Red Seal and skilled trade worker, this is good, but then you're missing out on a significant part of construction. And in the case of major project and defense investment, civil is a big part of that. So we're going to work on this, but very much a good step forward in the spring economic statement. The second aspect I want to mention is infrastructure investment. I think that's where you were about to go.
You're reading my mind.
That was the first leak we got. I think that was on Monday. Prime Minister said, hey, we're about to introduce a sovereign wealth fund, they call that, to directly invest into infrastructure projects. So this is an interesting one that honestly I didn't see coming. We didn't have a pre-briefing on this, so we're still digesting how it's going to work, how and will the money flow. So this is early days, of course, but it is a good news in concept, because what we've seen in the early government of Mark Carney, when Bill C5 was introduced with the One Canadian Economy, was the creation of the MPO, which is really a clearinghouse, a one-stop shop for project approval and a way for the Prime Minister to say these projects are of national importance, so we're going to clear them faster. This is, in my opinion, from what I read of it, a similar mechanism, but for a funding project, which was not the role of the MPO. The MPO was not a procurement agency.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have funding. They're there for clearing. This is now a way for the Prime Minister to say, if we want project done, we will finance them. We will support the monetary contribution needed for these projects to be realistic. So this will be a great complement of what's happening in terms of major project, MPO, etc. How will this roll out? We'll need a few months to figure that out, but good signal from yesterday's announcement.
Could they not have come up with a sexier name than Sovereign Wealth Fund?
it's yeah. I haven't looked into the terminology. I feel like there's a lot of Mark Carney behind that. I think this is an economist that wrote that document, not a politician. But at the end of the day, whatever works is best.
I think at the end of the day, too, everything you just mentioned, from the Team Canada Strong to the Sovereign Wealth Fund, still with that focus on construction. We're still riding that wave as we head into 2026. So a big part of that just recently happened as well is the majority government. What does that mean for construction? Obviously, it's these announcements are being pushed through at a faster pace.
Yeah, great question. I mean, the root question is, what does that mean for government, right? Because ultimately, they are the one impacted, and because their agenda is so pro-construction, it, of course, impacts us. So as you mentioned, the Carney government was a minority government as elected last year. There's a few things that happened in the last few months that led to where we are now in a majority government. And some of that was surprises and some of that was expected. So a number of members of parliament had to step away from their job and leave their seat in the course of the year. Good example is former Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, who's now an envoy to Ukraine. Bill Blair, former Minister of Public Safety, as well, stepped away from the role. So these seats became vacant. Another one is in Terrebonne, in Quebec. There was a legal contest in the result because they won from a single ballot. So this was a rerun of the election in a way. So these three seats were open for a by-election that took place on April 13, if I recall correctly. And there was a bit of a writing on the wall in this one, because the two Toronto seats were very heavily Liberal seats. Even in a situation where, for example, Trudeau was not all that popular, these were winnable seats for the Liberals. Under a very popular Prime Minister that is Mark Carney right now, the likelihood of them losing these two seats was next to none. The big question was Terrebonne, which was very much, I wouldn't say a coin flip, but the Bloc Québec was a very strong contender for Terrebonne, of course. So if that was the only variable for the election, that would have been a bit of a coin toss. But what happened, of course, is for weeks before, a number of members of parliament crossed the floor from the Conservative and the NDP. So this dynamic changed the thing, because between the time the by-election was called and the result, there was I think two more floor crossing, but at least one that made the big difference, where Terrebonne was no longer required to go to Liberals to form the majority. Of course, all of that's unfolded, and now the Liberals sits at 174 seats, so as a slim but clear majority in the House, allowing them for a few different things. So that's where I said what matters, what it means for government, and there's many layers to this. But number one is they own the majority of the House, so they no longer need the support of the Conservative or the NDP or the Bloc to get their budget passed through the House or any kind of significant vote where they could lose confidence. It's been a little while in Canada since we had the majority government, which is the way our system of parliament is meant to be run. We've historically had majority government all the time, except in the last 20 years, things have eroded a bit because we have bigger third parties. The NDP is much bigger. The Bloc Québécois is much bigger. So it's difficult to have a single party having 50% plus one of the seat. What that means is they don't need to go in the House to get approval for all these big votes. But more importantly, and we've seen this, I think, a couple of weeks ago, it allows the government to change the membership of the committees. So these groups that study the bill before they get in the House will now be much more controlled by the Liberal government. There will still be seats for the opposition, of course, and many MPs and ministers have said that they'll give them plenty of room to discuss policy. But of course, politically, when they have more control in the membership, they have more control on the committees as well. So we will see a bit of a shift in the discourse in the House and the impact of the procedure of Parliament that will be leaning toward the government agenda. So the witness call at committee might be more in favor of these kind of direction and policy, but I believe we still have some strong democratic discussion.
All right. Thanks for clarifying that. So another report, LP, a very important one that also came out this week, is the Canadian Construction Association Spring Economic Report. It was jam-packed full of information, my friend. I appreciated every fall and spring that you guys release it. So let's break it down. Obviously, the cost to build is a hot topic here at the BRCA. We're actually hosting a all-division forum on the fuel prices coming up next week. So break it down. What stood out? What do we need to know most about heading into the spring and summer months?
Yeah, and what an interesting timing we had, right? We plan these reports on a quarterly basis. They're always released at the end of the first month of the quarter. I've tried to get the Minister of Finance to change his own statement date, but that didn't work out. So we ended up releasing on the same day. Yesterday morning was the release of our report, a big one, as you mentioned. There's a number of indicators that we track report to report, quarter to quarter, and we want to keep that core very similar from report to report because we now have a lot of construction companies, big and small, that very much rely on that document to do a lot of their planning for the year to come. So it is important that we track vacancies, we track unemployment, we track a number of figures. But we always have a bit of a quarterly flavor to the report, a specific theme. This one was twofold. On one side, we looked at provincial budget. There was a number of them released in the last few months, Ontario, BC, Quebec, etc. So having a lens of what's happening provincially is quite important nationally because we have a federal government willing to invest, I would say, drastically in infrastructure, from trade to major project to defense, but not all provinces have the fiscal capacity to match that funding or promote it the same way. So, for example, the situation in BC is very different than the situation in Ontario right now, where Doug Ford is pushing really hard for some of these investments. BC or Quebec, for example, have a much more scaled-back approach, where they have to be mindful of capacity of investment. So we've been doing a bit of a recap of all of this. The second piece is very much around the cost of construction. We have been told by many of our members for about a year now that the changes in trade dynamic with the U.S., the change of the global geopolitical landscape have been quite impactful to supply chain. The ability to get material, the price of that material, and now for the last month and a half, the ability to move it because of the price of oil. So let me start there because that's a topic we do discuss in the report, and I think it's important to understand. Everybody talk about the price of oil and WTI, right? And of course, gas impact every industry. If you're a grocery chain, you need to get your produce through trucks that will be impacted by the price of transport. Construction is impacted in three ways, right? And that's what people don't fully understand. Of course, there's the price of transport. The trains and the trucks and the boats and the planes that move your goods will have more cost of transport, so your product are more expensive. But beyond that, there's two important factors. One, construction relies on petroleum product for a lot of their energy production. So pretty much every work site will have generators, heavy machinery that runs on diesel. In the case of civil construction, it's entire fleet of pavement vehicles and heavy machinery. So whenever the price of diesel and oil in general fluctuates, the entire production ecosystem of construction get impacted beyond the cost of transport. The third one, of course, is price of material made out of petroleum products. So if you think of PVCs and plastics, if you think of asphalt, if you think of membranes of all sorts, when the price of the raw product goes up, everything goes up. Polyethylene is a perfect example. The largest polyethylene market is in China, and if you look at the index that they have there in Asia, it's going through the roof at close to 9,000 Chinese yuan from 4 tons. So quite impactful for some plastics and some materials. So construction have to adapt, and construction company that want to bid on project need to try to plan what the price of oil will be going in the future, but the drastic uncertainty and the volatility of the price make it extremely difficult. So that's really the core problem. We don't know what we don't know, and we need to kind of plan and budget accordingly. One thing people don't really understand, and I do want to mention that, is the fluctuation in price we've seen so far is mostly speculative. And it is as bad as an impact, because if the price goes up, the price goes up. But the delay in actual supply of oil is quite significant. Most oil around the world, crude oil, is moved by tanker. Some regions have pipelines and rail and whatnot, but outside Europe and the North American market, it's mostly tankers. For a tanker to go from the Gulf Peninsula and go all the way to the east coast of the U.S., this is a significant route to take for a very large ship. And very large ships tend to be very slow. As a matter of fact, the average speed of a tanker is about the same as a bicycle. Not a motorcycle, a bicycle. So think about, riding a bicycle from Iran to Florida. Takes a long time, right? So if you look at the timeline of the conflict, when the Strait of Hormuz closed at the end of February, early March, there was a tanker that the day before crossed the strait and was ongoing on a 6-week trip to North America. These ships keep arriving all the way until April 15, 16, which is just a week or two ago. Now we are seeing the impact of a real shortage, of a real decline in imports of oils from these Middle East nations. Everything before was speculative. And at the same rate, the opposite is true. If by any miracle we see a resolution of the conflict between Iran and the U.S. and everything goes back to normal tomorrow, there will be a month and a half lag until supply goes back to normal at the pump. So that price is likely to stay up and very volatile for several months, even if we have a very quick resolution of the conflict.
If you were to look at the next year's LP, I mean, we're at this halfway point, I guess, of the year. You just released this report. The government released their report. What is CCCA? What should our listeners be watching more closely over the next 6 months?
There's a lot to watch for. I would say workforce remain a big issue that we need to look at. How will the spring economic statement impact the environment is important. How potential transformation of the immigration system that Ottawa is studying will impact that as well. We are also looking forward to hear more about the workforce alliances that were announced by Minister Patty Ajdu a month ago. They are now being formed and being engaged with representatives from industry, so that can have a very positive impact. I would keep track of all of this, but I think if I have to pick a single topic that people should pay attention, it's really the U.S. trade dynamic. Beyond the price of oil, what is happening with tariff and counter-tariff? What is happening with the CUSMA review? And how will that impact the price of everything? Let me take a minute to talk about CUSMA. There's a lot of misconception that it's a CUSMA renegotiation like we had under the first Trump president. I want to clarify, it's not. It's a review. So what it means is CUSMA is actually in force right now until 2036. So we have another decade of CUSMA plan. The review this year is to plan if we further extend that to 2042. So it's an extension that we're looking at expanding, not a cancellation of 2026 CUSMA. However, any government from any of the three countries can decide to step away from CUSMA within specific timelines. So it's not like there's any guarantee we will live through all of that. But that review is important because it gives some kind of certainty onward for a decade and beyond. And if that fails, then CUSMA remains in place until 2036, but we'll have an annual review to see if this is acceptable to keep it going. So there's going to be a lot of discussion in Washington, in Ottawa, on what CUSMA is and should be and how we negotiate the pain point that we'll have. So why is this important? I think there's a few layers to this. Of course, the U.S. will come at the table with their historical complaint, supply management in dairy, lumber, etc., and we'll come with our own. One interesting point that haven't been discussed yet at these negotiation table is Buy Canadian, which is fairly new. Buy Canadian was introduced in December 16. It's now in place for all federal procurement, and it's been rolled out for provincial transfer as well. So if Ottawa sends money to BC, for example, they will be required to match that Buy Canadian policy. There is challenge for that for construction. It will increase the price of construction even further, but it does create a protectionist regime for many of the subsector, for example, steel manufacturing. The question is, will Washington be upset about this? Because they have their own Buy America for a long time, but this is new. So we could see Buy Canadian be caught up in that negotiation, be part of the thing that could go or not during the summer.
So it's not like one of those, I think a lot of people are confused when you see the media headlines. It's not like on July 1st, the Trump administration can't just pull out and walk away from this deal. There's some processes in place and timelines, and et cetera.
Well, exactly. And more importantly, CUSMA's always had provision for countries to step away. It didn't need to wait to July. If Trump wanted to step away from CUSMA, he could have done that a year ago. He did not. So will he use the review as an excuse? I don't think so. But is it likely that we'll see Canada being back in U.S. news extensively? Yes. Because if you look, in the last 3 months, Trump hasn't said anything about Canadian tariff or the 51st state. He's very much focused on the dynamic in the Middle East. But when he's at the table renegotiating CUSMA, I'm sure there will be a lot of grandstanding statement that will be in that realm. And that can lead to, I would say, drastic decision from the White House, as we've seen before.
I heard also that he's pretty chummy with the King Charles as well. So that rhetoric.
He had an
is
interesting
kind of
tour there. Yeah, that was interesting.
All right, we won't go there. We won't go there, LP. But that was a lot of information in this episode. I always appreciate, as do our listeners, your insight and breaking down all of what's coming out of Ottawa. So you can find past episodes of the Builders Bench that feature LP on VRCA's website, vrca.ca. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and invite your friends and colleagues to take a seat on the bench with us. LP, thank you so much for taking a seat on the bench with us today.
Always a pleasure.
I'm Craig Larkins, and this is the Builders Bench.